welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Broback.
And this week we are not covering a novel. We are discussing yet another short story before our big two-part And Then There Were None series. Our short story is The Manhood of Edward Robinson.
An unfortunate title, if ever there were.
It's a little bit of an unfortunate title. I think it might have been more appropriate if his name was Richard Johnson, say, but it's not.
Oh, no.
It's Edward Robinson. and and that's what we have. So, Catherine Brobeck, could you tell us a little bit about the publication history on this one?
I can. It was first published in Graham Magazine in December of 1924 under the title The Day of His Dreams, which if you combine that with the current title does not really help matters. I'm going to be really honest with everybody up front. It seems like we are being very juvenile, but then you read the story and we're not that off base here.
Yeah, perhaps The Day of His Dreams was the better title, just in that it was safer than The Manhood of Edward Robinson. I wonder if it was as dangerous of a double entendre back then. I suppose not.
Clearly it wasn't.
Let's get into it. Our victim here is possibly women in general, because there is certainly a lot of what struck us as misogyny within this story. This is very much a story that is stuck in its time, stuck in 1924. Mm-hmm. We didn't know, by the way, that this is another Christie short story for Christmas.
It is.
It tickles me that Christie became known for writing a novel around Christmas time into the 70s, but that she did these short story Christie for Christmases within the 20s. And I guess it was like she was sort of teeing up or priming herself for the larger task she had ahead of her. Now, I never knew that that's how a lot of these short stories were originally created within Christmas issues. In any case, Christmas does appear within this story as well.
Right. It's set at Christmas. Christmas itself is in the story.
Oh, yes, we will get there. So the true victim within the context of the story is Edward Robinson himself for being a put upon man. More on that in a bit. And potentially Agnes Lorella, who we will meet in a moment, for getting her diamond stolen. Catherine, tell us about our suspect.
Well, it's one lady, Noreen Elliott, tabloid darling, society party girl extraordinaire, and a possible jewel thief.
As you can tell from the short list here of suspects and the weirdness of trying to assign a victim to the story, this is not a puzzle mystery. Our usual outline doesn't work all that well. This is not even a Christie thriller story. It's one of her light romantic, although anti-romantic is really how I would characterize it. But it's one of her lighter adventure stories.
Right.
Without much of a mystery. There's intrigue, but no true mystery.
What we should have noted is that this does not appear in the U.S. until much later. It's one of the collection stories that never got a separate publication in the U.S.
Whereas it appeared in the Listerdale Mystery Collection in the UK. And by the time we're done, the reason for its exclusion may be apparent.
So, on that note, Kemper, what is the world as it appears to be?
Okay, so we open on Edward Robinson lying to his fiancée, Maud, who he is madly in love with, but who's pretty much a giant Debbie Downer because she's frugal, i.e. cheap, and she's a bit of a hen-pecking shrew.
Mm-hmm.
She yells at him, poor Edward, for not buying the cheapest movie seats. She scolds him for buying too big of an engagement ring and then makes him return it for a smaller one. She says that they shouldn't marry until he's moved up a bit in his already decent job. And he rather resignedly goes along with all of this until he wins £500 in a newspaper contest involving the arrangement of women's names in a list. Which of these women do you prefer?
Well, I couldn't tell if it was that or if it was literal name popularity, because it's very unclear. List these in order of popularity, but then he does it based not on what his opinions are, but on some methodology that he's decided on.
Yeah, 12 girls' names had to be arranged in order of popularity. Edward had a brilliant idea. His own preference was sure to be wrong. He had noticed that in several similar competitions. So he wrote down the 12 names arranged in his own order of merit. Then he wrote them down again, this time placing one from the top and one from the bottom of the list alternately. So he just sort of mixed and matched what he thought was the right answer, knowing that his answer wouldn't be right. And it seems that he happened upon the solution because he won the overall contest. I have to say, in the adaptation, and we'll talk more about this after we go through the story as written, in the adaptation, it seemed more as if he was listing women by preference, and my sense was that they were looking at photos of women even, which is more honestly in keeping with the misogynistic tone of this story. So maybe I was just colored by that because I had already read the story at that point, and they were only looking at names even in the adaptation. But he has won 500 pounds. And he wants to tell Maud about the money. He knows that Maud is a great lover of money, and that she will be very excited.
She's just very, very tight on the purse strings.
Yes, so he knows what's going to happen. He knows that if he tells her about it, she's going to say, "That's fantastic. Put it in the bank." Mm-hmm. Obviously, she's not going to want him to spend it, but he wants to spend it on a shiny red 2-seater car that he passes in the shop windows every day on his way to work, and which he has been lusting over for quite some time.
We should also note at this point that Edward Robinson is apparently a voracious reader of romance novels of what appear to be maybe the bodice-ripping variety.
In a second, Catherine, I believe, is going to read out the selection that we get here from the romance novel, because that's in fact how the short story opens. Yeah. And I was really struck by this idea of a young man reading a romance novel.
It gets odder. So this is the opening line of the short story. With a swing of his mighty arms, Bill lifted her right off her feet, crushing her to his breast. With a deep sigh, she yielded her lips in such a kiss as he had never dreamed of. At which point, Edward starts sighing, and then he also begins to think at length about Bill and, quote-unquote, envied him his muscles, his rugged good looks, and his terrific passions.
He does also read the description of the proud Marchesa
Bianca.
Yeah,
except I have to say it's a paragraph later.
It's a sentence later, a sentence or two later. Yeah, it is odd. I actually think, and this is an appropriate or sort of pertinent conversation to have on this podcast, I think that the way readers consumed romance has really changed from the 1920s to the modern day. And I think that it was less strange to imagine a straight man reading a romance novel back then than it is now, if that makes sense. It doesn't seem like there's much of a place for straight men reading romance, and that's kind of fed back on itself to such a point that it seems ridiculous to imagine straight men reading romance. But I don't know if it was as ridiculous or odd back in the 1920s. I don't think it could have been, given the short story, how it opens.
Well, except for the fact that Christie, who is at this point, wife and mother, is writing this, and I don't exactly know what we should read into her opinion about young straight men and their reading habits. I mean, I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm just saying that as like a fact that it seems unlikely to me that this is accurate even in 1924.
I don't know about that. I think that Christie, this goes to her writing. She has empathy. She's able to write characters convincingly that aren't her.
I'm not making any argument about empathy. I'm just saying that I don't know that a 20-something-year-old man in 1924 was reading bodice rippers any more than he is now.
Maybe not, but I do have one anecdote to back up my claim that perhaps he might have been. And I remember in reading about the changing ways that the public responded to Pride and Prejudice since its publication now over 200 years ago, that especially within the 19th century and the later 19th century, Pride and Prejudice was a book that men talked about in terms of falling in love with Elizabeth Bennet. It read to them as a romance in which the object of their affection was Elizabeth Bennet. The reason why this point was made is that it was an article talking about how Pride and Prejudice has changed so much mainly since the infamous lake diving scene of Colin Firth in the 1995 BBC A&E version.
Fanning myself.
As was anyone attracted to the male sex. But Jane Austen nowadays seems to be read as a
women's fiction,
a romance that is objectifying, or at least a romance that is meant for those who are attracted to men, not necessarily to be read by men who are attracted to women. But apparently it was really very much the opposite in the 19th century, or at least there was a lot of room for reading the novel way. And there isn't that much room for it now.
Let me make a counter argument. Who was capable of reading?
Well, there were certainly lots of women reading in the late 19th century.
Of course there were. But I mean, the bulk of the buyers of books were not women in bookstores. I mean, today, the biggest group of book buyers by far are women. But that was not the case in, 1872 or something. And I mean, I would also note that the counter argument to this is that there is a distinct tradition of Victorian art that is especially about like goddesses and other sort of allegorical stories, etc., which are basically excuses for soft pornography. I don't think that men were exactly necessarily looking towards bodice strippers. I mean, I just find it an unusual way to start a short story.
Absolutely. I am willing to give Christie the benefit of the doubt because
I think Is that where this is?
I guess the Pride and Prejudice example I think is illuminating because I think that men, as absolutely the more powerful consumers at a period like the late 19th century, if they weren't interested in reading that, they wouldn't have. And they certainly had lots of other things to turn to, including that softcore porn as art and whatnot. And they did, but they also consumed literature perhaps in a different way from how it's more popularly consumed now. I mean, every age has its own sort of quirks and foibles, and there's always a context within which to read things. So perhaps it was different. My only argument is perhaps it wasn't quite as ridiculous and just bizarre as it seems to us now.
I think you are probably giving her more of the benefit of the doubt than I would, but that is fine. We can go ahead with that assumption because after we get all of Edward Robinson's pinings about his romance novel, it turns out he really wants to be Bill, the hero of the romance novel, and he wants a Marchesa Bianca to call his own, and he wants his 465-pound two-seater with a quote-unquote long shining nose. Gosh darn it. If I were rich, Edward had said to it, day after day, if I were rich, I'd have you. This is a direct quote. I just want to be clear.
I also have to say the other major literary reference that we would be remiss not to point out here is, of course, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And this is written way before The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which was in, I think it was 1939. So this is a good 15 years before that. This is it became such a classic trope. And I think we also should give Christie credit for writing something that wasn't yet tired. And would become the sort of classic notion of a man dreaming at what he could be.
Yeah, middle-class office worker, like, pining over something that he's not.
Yeah, like it reads, I think, as a more tired premise to us now in the post-Walter Mitty world, but I think it's just worth noting that this is predating it by many years.
Well, and I mean, it's also a story about a man who buys a red sports car because he's having a crisis about a woman.
Hey, also a new sort of a story in 1924. Cars haven't been around that long.
No cars. Yeah, absolutely. So kudos to Agatha for getting that accurate.
She also, by the way, Agatha herself loved cars, and she spills a lot of ink in her autobiography about the first car that she purchased.
Oh, well, there's a lot of detail to the cars, I think, in a lot of her stories and novels.
Yeah.
Suffice it to say, though, Edward, like Stella, gets his groove back by buying that red sports car.
Yes, he does. He buys the car. And then what does he do? Well, he lies about it to Maud. Over the break from his job during the Christmas holidays, he begins taking his, quote, lovely creature, end quote, out to the country. because he has to get driving lessons.
Well, he's been taking the driving lessons in the city, and then he goes and practices outside of London, right?
So he's, quote, bathed in ecstasy, end quote, about his purchase, and, quote, enslaved body and soul, end quote, by his car. So we're getting, we're getting the sense here that it's as if he's cheating on his fiancée with this car. And having told Maud he was visiting a country friend and in a mood of, quote, high adventure of daredevil wickedness, end quote, he heads out of London and he lunches and dines by himself. Then he ends up driving much later than expected and at the Devil's Punch Bowl in Hindhead, where the freshly fallen snow proves too much to pass up. So he gets out of the car to go frolic in the snow, child that he is, and just, take a little constitutional in the bracing air.
Yeah, and when he gets back to his car, he goes to reach for his muffler, but instead finds a diamond necklace worth thousands.
Of course, because it's a silly Christie story, so there's going to be jewels.
And then he very quickly realizes it's not his car, but a very similar one, if a little bit more used than his brand new one. And the reason he doesn't go to the police is primarily because he can't remember his license plate number. Which, okay.
Oh, Edward.
But, and I mean, like, at some level, fine. But what he does next is where it's a little like, oh, Edward. He sees there's a note on the necklace, and it reads, "Meet me, Green, corner of Salter's Lane, 10 o'clock. And I guess apparently struck dumb completely by the influence of When Love is King, which, by the way, is the name of the romance novel, if we have not mentioned that. He decides to show up at the corner of Salter's Lane with a necklace. See what happens.
Indeed. So, at Salter's Lane, he sees a young woman, hair black as night, lips as scarlet as Marchesa Bianca's, in full evening dress and a cloak. This woman was expecting Gerald, and he tries to explain the mix-up, but it turns out that it's fine he's Edward, even if she hasn't seen him since she was 6. She just sort of doesn't really...
Like, oh, yeah, Edward, sure.
Yeah, she's like, okay, great.
Yeah, like, oh, man, I haven't seen you since I was a kid. Like, but cool, thank you for picking me up. She kind of very obliquely explains the situation to him and why, quote-unquote, Jimmy isn't also there. Because, you see, as it turns out, those are stolen diamonds. And, yeah, quelle surprise. And Jimmy apparently dressed as a woman and broke into the home of aforementioned Agnes Lorella and set off a squib to distract everyone, while at the same time our unnamed pretty young woman in the car shimmied up into the bedroom window and stole thousands of dollars in diamonds. And then, so shimmying back down the window, she dumps them into Gerald's car with the note before running away because Jimmy hasn't been able to catch up with her because he has, in fact, sprained his ankle on his woman's dress while running away. Edward takes this pretty much at face value.
Yes, he does. And he's not even driving the car at this point. This unnamed, crazy, thieving woman is driving because Edward just is not a very good driver. Again, just learned a couple of weeks ago. And she drives them to a huge London house where a butler gets new clothes for him so that they can go to Ritzon's, a famous nightclub for the wealthy and fashionable. So what happens at Ritzon's and how does this adventure resolve itself?
Well, at Ritzon's, it becomes clear that she's, in fact, the famous Lady Noreen Elliot, the most talked about girl in England. She's engaged to Captain James Folliot, VC of the Household Cavalry. And, of course, Edward knows all this from, I guess, the, tabloids.
Right.
So after cocktails and dancing, he kind of is like, so, tell me about, this whole criminal enterprise. And she is super chill about it. She's like, oh, yeah, let's totally sit down with more cocktails and I will totally tell you about this. So she basically explains to Edward that she got bored of her previous adventures. So she and Jimmy obviously being Captain James Folliot, had started playing quote-unquote burglary, which had a £50 entrance fee. And then you drew names, and so they drew Agnes Lorella, and so they had to steal something from her. So they stole her diamonds, and they had to steal it within 3 days of pulling her name. And then you have to wear the stolen goods for at least an hour in public, or you forfeit the stake and pay £100 fine. And this is the third time they've played. So bright young things, fake robbing each other.
Right, people who have way too much time on their hands.
Way too much time and money, because think about this, it's 1924, and if you don't go through with it, you have to pay £150.
It's a lot of money now.
She says that she got bored with scavenger hunts.
Right. So finally, Gerald Champneys tracks them down in Edward's car to explain what happened, at which point Edward himself makes a runner for his real car, which is now finally in the vicinity, allowing Lady Noreen to think he's an actual jewel thief, that he was sort of in on this the whole time and just trying to pull a real score off of all this jokiness. So she chases after him, jumps on his running boards, and takes back the diamond necklace while he dashes off into the night.
Well, and also I have to note, Lady Noreen seems to be delighted that he might actually be a real jewel thief.
Oh, yeah. It's as if she's had a brush with someone real.
Well, and she's just like, but we had a fun time. This is delightful. She's basically one step away from ripping the necklace out of his hand and saying, we should do this again sometime.
You know what it reminds me of? Bear with me for this reference.
Okay.
Do you remember Adaptation? The Charlie Kaufman movie, which started as an adaptation. The project was to adapt Susan Orlean's
The
Orchid Thief. Yeah. And Meryl Streep in the movie plays Susan Orleans, who goes down and has an experience with this titular orchid thief, who is just a larger than life, very real kind of person. And then she goes back to her highfalutin society friends in Manhattan, and you can tell she just feels empty and not fulfilled by them anymore. And it almost, I wonder if this is what's going to happen to Lady Noreen, because she feels that she just had a brush with the real thing, and it was so truly exciting, as opposed to all the pretense that she's just forced to do because she's stuck in her ivory tower.
It's her gateway drug.
Exactly. So Lady Noreen might be the true victim here, because I think she's probably going to be locked up in an actual prison in about 3 to 4 years after the story ends.
She's very wealthy, and I am sure Jimmy
she'll get a good lawyer.
Yeah, and Captain James Folliot, he equally criminal to her right now, or at least wannabe criminal, right? They're playing fake criminal.
Right. I
mean, they will have each other's back.
That's
like
true.
that line. It's that line in 30 Rock.
I'm feeling pretty drunk.
Well, it's business drunk. It's like rich drunk. Either way, it's legal to drive.
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, this story is probably almost as problematic in terms of its class implications as it is in terms of its gender implications. You could break it down that way.
Right,
also.
sure.
In any case, the next day is Christmas, and Edward strolls into Maud's house in Clapham, and he just tells her, you know what? I lied to your face, Maud. I won £500. I bought a car, and there is nothing more to be said about it. That's exactly what he says to her. And then he says, the second thing is this. I'm not going to hang about for years. My prospects are quite good enough, and I mean to marry you next month. See? And what does Maud do, Catherine?
Maud is like, oh. She's like, oh, God, I've just seen Colin Firth come out of the lake.
Mr. Darcy?
Miss Bennet.
That's exactly how she reacts.
And the actual quote is, she gazed at him, fascinated. There was awe and admiration in her eyes, and the sight of that look was intoxicating to Edward. Anyway, Maud agrees to marry him, basically solely on how different he is at that moment, which seems like a super healthy way to enter into a long-term relationship, but hey. And then he takes her in his arms, quote unquote, as Bill the Superman might have done. And then she says, oh, Edward, breathed Maud. I adore you.
And with an ellipsis, and there could be so much contained in that ellipsis.
I mean,
that is how we end the story.
So many things contained in that ellipsis.
Happy Christmas, Edward and Maud.
Happy Christmas to Edward, I think.
Here was one of my takeaways within the kind of greater context of Christie as we've been working through her canon. We've come across this notion before, and it's usually within the voice of Papa Poirot about how men need to just take charge and women don't like a mealy-mouthed man. And if you allow a woman to run over you, she will run over you and she'll never respect you. And the way to happiness lies in just standing up and being a man.
Well, I mean, it's very much that bodice ripper romance novel idea.
Sure. The thing is, we talk about giving Christie the benefit of the doubt when we come across stuck in its time elements such as these. And while I'd like to think that this
is in its time,
I think that a writer such as Christie, with her ability to perceive what her audience wants, despite whatever her own predilections might be, I don't think she would have been as forthright with those sorts of ideas if she were writing today versus writing in the 20s and 30s. But she fills out Poirot's character often in that way. But I have to believe, after reading this story and seeing enough of this idea outside of Poirot, that Christie herself at least somewhat held this view, or at least thought it was a dominant enough view that it was worth exploring so much.
There is this sort of 50 Shades of Grey thing, right? Which is, obviously still prevalent enough that they could make 3 movies after the books about it. So clearly there's a huge audience for that. And so I don't think that that's gone away. I don't think it's stuck in its time. I mean, the thing that I would hope would be stuck in its time is the idea that you could have like a practical wife and have like a decent home life and you don't have to be like Tarzan.
I think that, 50 Shades of Grey, I think, is doing something different because it hinges on this whole idea that in the bedroom, yes, that dynamic may exist, but in every other way, I think part of the wish fulfillment of those books is that Anna is kind of taming Christian in all other realms of being. And that's what makes it okay. That's what makes sort of the erotica of it okay. But what this is doing is just really saying that Edward Robinson is taking charge in every single way a man can take charge, and that's why they're going to be happy. There are certainly people who think that way. There are people who hold that opinion today. I have to think if Christie were writing this story in 2018, I think it would have ended up a little differently or been told slightly differently. We could transition to the adaptation because the adaptation does shift it slightly. And I thought that was really interesting because the adaptation was released in 1982. This is the Agatha Christie Hour, which we've spoken about before. And they adapted a number of one-off, we could call them random Christie stories. And this story is from the Listerdale Mystery Collection. And it's one of the 10 that they chose to adapt. The character does exist in the short story of Maud's mother, but they make a lot more of her. In the adaptation, when Edward becomes a man and wins Maud over, he does it by standing up not to Maud, but to her mother. And it's like he breaks free from the bonds that his mother-in-law or his future mother-in-law is imposing on both him and his daughter. And you get the sense that Maud also wants to break free from her, but she can't quite do it herself because she's her daughter and they're not married yet, but she's sort of longing to do so. Right. And Edward takes charge of that. And that is a much more palatable story turn.
But it's not just even more palatable. It's like that's actually an appealing thing, right?
Yeah.
You could do that in 2018, and I think that having somebody stand up for you or your relationship would be an appealing thing. So I mean, the problem is that's not really in this story. It's just that and like Maud is not making any money by all appearances. It's Edward, and she's just yelling at him for anything.
It's a total change from the page. I think it's a smart change because it makes The episode charming, as I'm sure you can tell, neither of us found this story charming. We found it to be problematic, but I found the episode to be charming with that change, and also due to the fact that it starred an actor we have talked about before briefly, Nicholas Farrell, who is just one of those British character actors who, if you are a fan of mysteries and other things, he's done a lot. You've just seen him so many times, and this is one of the very first things he did. He actually has a supporting role in Chariots of Fire, which came out a year before. That still might be one of his more famous credits, but he's very young and very charming, I think, and charismatic in this adaptation. But like, just to do a very quick rundown of some of the other mysteries that he's done. He was in the David Suchet Poirot series twice, and we've talked about both of those appearances at this point. First in the ABC Murders as Donald Fraser, which is a strong supporting role in 1992, and then as Knighton in The Mystery of the Blue Train in 2005. But he's also just he was in Father Brown, he was in Inspector Lewis, Foyle's War, he was also in Midsummer Murders, he was in Bramwell. Like, he's just one of those people that if you enjoy this kind of British prestige TV, you've seen his face a lot.
I would really like somebody to make a master list of crossovers of people who have been in the Morse universe, the Christie-verse, Midsummer Murders. I mean, I would just like a Venn diagram, because I bet you the Venn diagram is mostly the center section. Because I bet you that so many people have been in a Poirot, have been in like a Midsummer Murders.
Have been in all of them. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. He was also in the Inspector Lindley mysteries, by the way.
Sure.
Yeah, no, that tends to happen. It is unusual for an actor to play two completely different characters in two different Poirot novels, who are both important characters like that, and they are far apart. So they really did try to avoid that within the Suchet series.
We've made the comment before where we were talking about Duckface and how it feels like Duckface appears in everything.
Anna Chancellor, yes. Speaking of the Colin Firth Pride and Prejudice, she's Miss Bingley.
Right, so Austen, add Austen adaptations to that circle.
Oh yeah, it's Austen adaptations. It's masterpiece, what's called a masterpiece classic now. I'm using air quotes. It's the mystery series. He's just one of those people, but he's always a welcome addition. I'm always happy to see his face, which is also a striking face. He has a very prominent chin and sort of like a bulbous nose. He's not handsome, but he's striking in a weird way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Also, we should note that there is a supporting role here played by none other than Rupert Everett. And yes, this is in 1982. So Rupert Everett was 23 at that point. It's surprising that he was nearly 40 in My Best Friend's Wedding, because he certainly looked a lot younger than that.
Another country? Because speaking of Colin Firth, right? Isn't Colin Firth in Another Country? Rupert Everett and Colin Firth, gay boarding school story.
And actually, in Another Country, his character name was Guy, which is also his character name in The Manhood of Edward Robertson. He's one of the pretty young things who gallivants about. All of that business, too. There's an extended sequence where Edward is dancing with Lady Noreen, and they're trying to evade the crew before Edward or the audience knows exactly what's happening. So we think that these people are really out to get them.
Quick, Edward, into the middle of the floor. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. Thanks a lot. Dance, Edward. Just dance.
Who the hell is he? She calls him Edward.
Gerald's brother?
Nothing like him.
It's fun, and the physical hijinks of it are really enjoyable to watch. And it brought the adventure story aspect of the original to life in a way that it didn't for me on the page. So this is one where I actually enjoyed the adaptation significantly more than the original.
I have to say about this short story, though, the adventure part, if you can separate it in any way, is not enjoyable. It's just that the context of it is terrible.
Right. The Listerdale mystery in general, and we've talked about our fondness for the Listerdale mystery, especially Catherine's. This is the 5th story within the Listerdale mystery collection that we've covered. And they really are all showing that lighter, fun, flirty side of Christie that, other than these stories, we really only get from those early thrillers, because they were written around the same time that she was writing the early thrillers. And I appreciate that side of Christie. I think that sometimes that lightness can grate a little bit in novel form. It gets a little old after a while, but it's suited to the short story form. So I think that goes a long way to making these stories quite enjoyable.
Right.
Well, that is The Manhood of Edward Robinson. Join us next week. We are so excited for part 1 of And Then There Were None. We will be speaking solely about the text of the novel and the play that Christie adapted herself. Can't really overstate how excited we are to reach this milestone within Christie's oeuvre. Yeah, and then the week after that, we will be discussing the film adaptations of And Then There Were None with our good friend Mark Aldridge. So we've got lots of fun in the immediate future here on the podcast for a major novel that we imagine most, if not all of you, have already read. Perhaps you're rereading it right now.
If you haven't reread it recently, we can say this, and maybe this is a spoiler alert, but it's definitely a good reread.
It is a fantastic reread. In the meantime, we always love hearing from you. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. We are on Instagram at All About Agatha. And we would love to hear from you via ratings and reviews wherever you're listening to this podcast. We very much appreciate those. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.